Picture a January morning in 1870s rural England. Your breath hangs in front of your face before you've even gotten out of bed. The fire died sometime around 3 in the morning. You can tell because the water in the clay pot on the hearth shelf has a skin of ice on it, not thick, just enough to clink when you tap it with a finger. You've got maybe 2 hours before the children wake up, and the woodpile you stacked in October is already 2/3 gone. It's January, and you've still got February and half of March ahead of you. Now picture the man 3 farms down. Same county, same winter. He went into December with the same size woodpile you did, maybe even a little smaller, because he spent so much time doing what everybody in the village thought was the strangest thing they'd seen in years. He built himself a hut, not instead of his cabin, but around it. Woven hazel panels, the kind shepherds used for sheep pens, standing a couple of feet out from his walls on all 4 sides and across the roofline. People made jokes about it all the way through October. By February, he was the only one in the parish still sleeping past 5. I want to tell you what he knew that his neighbors didn't. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Here's the thing, most people get completely wrong about how a building loses heat. They imagine it like a bucket leaking heat just slowly drips out through the walls, and thicker walls mean a slower drip. That's partly true, but it misses 2 of the 3 ways heat actually escapes, and the 2 it misses are the ones that kill you in a January wind. I've been deep in the research on this for months, and the more I dug, the more I realized that the people who figured this out weren't engineers with thermometers. They were shepherds and farmers. People who spent their winters outdoors watching what happened to sheep in a draft versus sheep behind a wicker screen. Let me show you exactly what was happening in that man's walls and why his neighbor's laughter stopped right around the time the February firewood ran out. But first I need to take you somewhere else entirely. Mendoza, Argentina, 2018. A researcher named Guillermo Coutinho is standing next to an experimental building made from wattle and daub, the same basic technology as our hazel panels, woven organic material packed with an earthen mixture, and he's measuring the temperature difference between the inside and the outside on a cold night. The exterior temperature drops to -6 degrees Celsius, roughly 21 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, 10 degrees Celsius. That's a 1-6 degree Celsius temperature gap held by a wall that costs almost nothing to build, requires no industrial process, and has been sitting there in optimum condition for 14 years. He's not the only one who measured this. A German archaeological team excavating a Bronze Age site at Langenselbold in 2003 found double-walled wattle construction, 2 woven screens with dry grass stuffed in between that they could calculate a U value for. The wall's thermal performance, by the standards of modern building physics, wasn't matched by European building code until 1995. That's 3,400 years later, the same idea, performing better than what most of us lived in for most of human history. So when I tell you that a man with hazel panels and a decent understanding of his local weather could meaningfully cut his winter fuel bill, I'm not telling you a folktale. I'm telling you something that has been measured, reproduced, and verified across centuries and continents. What I need to tell you is how it worked, because the explanation most people reach for, trapped dead air insulates, gets the mechanism half right and misses the other half entirely. And the half it misses is actually the more important one. Let me put you inside the wall of that man's cabin for a minute. You're a log, 8 inches of seasoned oak. On one side of you, there's a fire burning. Someone's carefully feeding it hardwood to keep the temperature around 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the room. On the other side of you is January in the English countryside, which on a good day in the 1870s might mean 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and on a bad day with a northeast wind coming off the North Sea might mean 15 degrees Fahrenheit and gusting. Heat moves through you, that's conduction. It's slow through wood. A solid 8-inch oak log wall has a thermal resistance of roughly 9 inches modern terms. Good, not great. The heat crawls through you, degree by degree, and eventually reaches your outer surface. Now it's on your outer face, and that's where things get ugly. There's a thin layer of air clinging to you, your surface film. On a still day, This film has a resistance of about R0, 68. It's insulating you a little. The warm air from your surface stays near you for a moment before it rises and is replaced by cooler air. But then the wind picks up. At 15 miles per hour, that surface film collapses to R0, 17. You've lost 3/4 of its resistance in a gust. The outer surface of your log wall is now directly exposed to moving cold air that strips heat away the instant it reaches you. This is forced convection. And in a 1870s British farmhouse gaps in the chinking, ill-fitted window frames, a door that doesn't quite seat properly, the wind isn't just stripping your outer surface. It's coming through the gaps, inside the walls, directly into the room. This is where most of the heat goes, not through the logs, but through the gaps, through the infiltration, through the relentless replacement of warm indoor air with cold outdoor air every time the wind finds a way in. That's what the Hazel screen stopped. Here's what happens when you put a woven Hazel panel 2 feet out from that wall. The wind hits it first. And Hazel hurdle panels, traditional English sheep hurdles, 6 feet by 3.5 feet, woven around upright stakes called zales from rods cut on a 5 to 7 year coppice rotation, are semi-permeable. The wind doesn't slam into a solid barrier and create turbulence. It filters through the weave. By the time the air that has come through reaches your log wall, it's moving at maybe 1/4 of its original speed. Penn State's extension studies on windbreaks show that a semi-permeable screen on the windward side of a building reduces air infiltration by up to 60%. A study out of Nebraska comparing identical houses, one sheltered by a windbreak, one fully exposed, found the sheltered house used 23% less fuel across a full heating season. South Dakota, similar study design, similar result, 34% less electricity for the sheltered home. That's the windbreak doing most of the work, not trapped air. The mechanical reduction in air movement, both the stripping of the surface film and the forcing of cold air through every crack and gap, is the primary mechanism, and it's dramatic. Because the space between the Hazel screen and the wall isn't empty of physics. Air sitting in a sheltered, calm space does behave differently than air in the open, not as differently as people sometimes claim, but differently enough to matter. Here's the part that trips people up, and I got this wrong myself for a while when I first started researching it. Still, air is a genuinely excellent insulator. Its thermal conductivity is 0.024 watts per meter Kelvin, roughly comparable to fiberglass insulation by conductivity alone. You can do the math and get excited. 6 inches of dead air between your Hazel screen and your log wall, you're imagining R30 or R20. The problem is that air doesn't stay still in a 6-inch gap. Temperature differences across the gap, the cold side near the Hazel screen, the warmer side near the log wall, create convection currents. Warm air rises near the wall, cool air sinks near the screen, and you get a slow churning loop that transfers heat across the gap far more efficiently than conduction alone would. ASHRAE's Handbook of Fundamentals has measured this extensively. The result: a 3/4 inch air gap gets you about R1. A 1-inch gap gets you about R1. A 6-inch gap gets you about R1. The gap stops providing more resistance past 3/4 of an inch, because past that point, convection takes over. So the Hazel screen sitting 2 feet from the wall isn't trapping a thick slab of insulating air. It's creating a calm, sheltered buffer zone where the outer surface of the log wall is no longer subject to wind. The R value of the air gap itself adds about R1 to the wall's total resistance, real, useful, but not the main story. The main story is the windbreak. Combined R1 from the sheltered air gap, plus the 25–35% reduction in whole building heat loss from wind protection and reduced infiltration, you get a total heating improvement that could, on a bad winter night in a drafty farmhouse, reach the higher end of those windbreak numbers, maybe 30–35% in realistic conditions. But what if the gap wasn't air? Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and here's where the Bronze Age builders at Langenselbold enter the conversation. The 2003 excavation found double-walled wattle construction with dry grass packed between the panels, not an air gap, but loose organic fill. and loose organic material, straw, dried grass, leaves, bracken, works completely differently from a free air gap. Straw has a thermal conductivity of 0.07 watts per meter Kelvin. A 6-inch layer of loose straw between your Hazel screen and your wall adds approximately R8 to R15 of thermal resistance, depending on how densely it's packed. That's roughly equivalent to adding a full layer of modern fiberglass batting to your cabin wall. Combined with the wind protection, combined with the improved surface film on the outer face of the Hazel screen rather than the log wall itself, and combined with the reduction in air infiltration, now you're talking about heating improvements that could, in a very exposed, very drafty structure, reach somewhere in the range of 50 to 60%. And here's what I think happened with the 75% number, because it isn't crazy and it's not a lie. It's what you get when you start from a particularly bad baseline. Let me tell you what 40 cords of firewood looked like. That's what the historians say a colonial New England household burned per year using an open hearth fireplace. Garrett Livermore, the vice president for education at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, puts it clearly. The open fireplace was so inefficient that most of the heat went up the chimney. The fire actually made the room colder in some conditions. It consumed indoor air faster than it produced warmth, pulling freezing air in through every gap in the structure to replace what the draft was sucking out. 40 cords. At 128 cubic feet per cord, that's 5,120 cubic feet of wood. A full-size pickup truck can hold about 1 cord. Barbara Rimkunas, historian at the Exeter Historical Society in New Hampshire, traces this consumption pattern through colonial-era records and finds it consistent. In a poorly built, drafty structure with an open hearth, the numbers are staggering. The open fireplace wasn't just inefficient at converting wood to heat, it actively worked against the building's warmth. The chimney drew air out of the room. To replace that air, the building sucked cold outside air through every gap and crack in the structure. The fire and the draft worked together in a feedback loop. More fire meant more draft meant more cold infiltration. More cold infiltration meant more fire. You were essentially heating the outdoors with a small margin of warmth captured inside. The Rumford fireplace, designed by Sir Benjamin Thompson Count Rumford in 1796, attacked this specifically. Thompson, an American-born scientist working in Bavaria and later London, measured the heat output of open fires and found them shockingly wasteful. His redesign was narrower, shallower, with angled sides to reflect more heat into the room, and a restricted throat to reduce the chimney draft. Households that switched to Rumford fireplaces immediately noticed the difference. Benjamin Franklin's stove designs in the 1740s, refined through the late 18th century, had already cut average consumption roughly in half, and iron cookstoves cut it further. By the 1850s, average households in well-settled areas were burning around 15 cords, not 40. That journey from 40 cords to 15 wasn't achieved by insulating the walls. It was achieved by fixing the combustion and reducing the chimney draft. The 60% improvement came from the stove, not the building. But a farmer in 1870s England who had a drafty timber-framed structure and a hearth fire, and who added a Hazel screen stuffed with loose straw around his walls, could see a genuine 30 to 50% reduction in his fuel bill. In the worst possible starting condition, small structure, maximally exposed, wind coming directly off open ground with no natural shelter, gaps in the chinking, windows that don't seal well pile straw-stuffed Hazel panels around it, and the arithmetic starts to favor the extravagant claim. I think 75 is the number people remember because it's the number someone said after the worst winter they'd ever seen, and the worst winter they'd ever seen was genuinely bad. Let me tell you what Hazel hurdle making actually was, because most people have no real picture of it. Hazel hurdles were the sheep farming infrastructure of southern England, not a curiosity, not a heritage craft that existed on the margins, but the core technology of the sheep and corn system that fed most of England's population for centuries. The craft dates back, at minimum, to the Neolithic. Archaeologists found 40 meters of carefully made woven Hazel panels at the Somerset levels, serving as trackways across marshy ground. Oliver Rackham, who spent his career documenting British woodland history, traced coppicing evidence to at least 4,500 BC, and noted that the hazel found in the Somerset level trackways showed signs of woodland management, regular cutting, uniform rod growth that required at least 120 years of accumulated practice before those particular panels were made. By the medieval period, coppice woodland was so economically essential that the Domesday Book recorded every wood in England as belonging to some person or community. Henry VIII's 1544 statute required coppice woods to be enclosed after cutting, not for conservation, but because the regrowth was too valuable to let animals eat. Hazel was cut on a 5 to 7 year rotation. The stump, the stool, would regrow into multiple straight rods, cut again, regrow, cut again, for centuries. Some hazel stools that are still productive today were established in the medieval period. A skilled hurdle maker could produce about 4 panels a day, each panel 6 feet long, 3.5 feet high, woven around 10 or 12 upright zales from the same hazel rods, with the horizontal weaving rods twisted back on themselves at the ends to lock the structure together without nails or fasteners. The finished panel could be driven into the ground with a mallet, moved and used again. That's why shepherds valued them so much. They folded, stacked, carried. You could fold the whole sheepfold in a morning, move it a half mile, and set it up again by afternoon. And the relevant point for our story, they were semi-permeable. A properly made hurdle let wind through didn't stop it, filtered it, and that distinction matters enormously to the physics of what happens when you build them around a cabin. Baghurst, in Hampshire, was the center of the hurdle trade into the 20th century. The last makers there were forced to find alternative work by 1959, as the economics of sheep farming shifted away from fold grazing toward permanent enclosures, and the demand for portable panels collapsed. The Heritage Crafts Association now lists traditional hazel hurdle making as a craft at risk of dying out entirely. A few dozen practitioners in Britain, most of them part-time. That near extinction matters to our story, because what disappeared with the hurdle makers wasn't just a technique for folding sheep. It was an embodied understanding of how woven organic material interacts with moving air, an understanding so refined that it produced a consistent product, a 6 by 3.5 foot panel, woven to a specific porosity that maximized wind reduction without creating the turbulence. A solid barrier would for thousands of years without a single written specification. The hurdle maker knew the weave by feel. Too tight, and you got turbulence on the lee side. Too loose, and the wind came through without slowing. The right porosity achieved by feel, by training, by the judgment in the hands of someone who'd woven 5,000 panels, was the optimum for windbreak function. Modern wind engineering, studying porous fences and shelter belts, has since confirmed this. A porosity of around 40 to 50% gives better wind protection over a wider area than either a solid barrier or a very open screen. The hurdle makers hit that number by eye, consistently, for millennia. There were shepherds in the Dorset chalk country in the 1840s and 1850s who understood, without ever having seen an Ashray handbook, that their sheep were warmer behind a wicker screen than in a solid-walled pen. They understood it because they watched it. Sheep put behind a hurdle on the windward side of a fold would gain weight through the winter, and sheep without the hurdle wouldn't. This wasn't theoretical. It was the difference between a profitable lambing season and a bad one. Someone, and this is where I wish we had names, but we don't, because this kind of knowledge rarely makes it into written records. Someone in that tradition looked at their own drafty cottage and had the same thought. If it works for the sheep, why not for the house? Because the physics is identical. Now let me take you back to where we started. January. The water in the clay pot on the hearth shelf has ice on it. You're trying to calculate how long your wood is going to last. Here's what your neighbor with the hazel screens understood about your problem that you didn't. Your cabin loses heat in 3 ways. The first is conduction heat moving through your walls, floor, and ceiling. This is the one everyone thinks about. You can't do much about it with a hazel screen. Conduction through the logs is conduction through the logs. The R value of the air gap adds something about R1, but this isn't the main event. The second is convection and infiltration, air moving. Cold outside air finding its way in through every gap, crack, and poorly fitted joint, replacing warm air that's already been heated at the cost of firewood. On a still day, this is manageable. On a day with a 1.5 mile an hour wind, the building is essentially breathing cold air in and pushing warm air out constantly, and your fire is desperately trying to keep up with that exchange. This is where 25 to 35% of your fuel bill lives. The Hazel screen, by cutting wind speed at the wall surface to a fraction of open field velocity, attacks this directly. The third is surface convection, the stripping of that thin, warm surface film off your outer walls. At wind speed, R0, 17. Sheltered, R0, 68. Small numbers, but they compound with everything else. Now, if the gap between your Hazel screens and your walls is stuffed with loose organic material, and a man who'd watched his sheep behind hurdle pens probably knew to do this, the story changes again. Because that loose material does what a free air gap cannot. It divides the air into tiny pockets, each one too small to develop convection currents. The organic matter, the straw or bracken or dried leaves, catches the air and holds it still, and still air actually insulates. At those pocket scales, it really does approach the theoretical figure. 6 inches of packed straw delivers R10 to R15 of additional wall resistance, stacked on top of your existing log wall, and the wind protection and the surface film improvement. That's when the numbers start to look like they could reach the higher claims. The title of this video says 75%. I've been honest with you about where the peer-reviewed science puts the realistic figure for a Hazel windbreak alone, 25 to 35%. The packed gap version, under ideal conditions, from a very bad starting baseline, maybe 50 to 60. But here's what I'll stand by completely. The concept is real. The physics is real. The tradition is documented over thousands of years. And the man in the video title was working from accumulated practical wisdom that was older than the Roman occupation of Britain. He arrived at a true conclusion by a rougher path than the one modern building science takes. Here's something I didn't expect to find when I started researching this. The German site at Langenselbold isn't a curiosity. The researchers who excavated it in 2003 found the double wattle construction in a Bronze Age settlement dated to approximately 1400 BC, 2 woven panels, dry grass between them. They calculated the wall's U value, the standard measure of how much heat moves through a unit of wall area per degree of temperature difference, and found it sat at 0.5 to 1 watts per square meter per Kelvin. When they presented these results at the 2009 Hessentag exhibition in Germany, a local energy official noted that this performance level wasn't required by German building code until the Wärmeschutzverordnung of 1995. That's a 3,400-year gap. The Bronze Age builders had solved an insulation problem that industrial modernity didn't catch up to in code until the last decade of the 20th century. Why did it get lost? That's actually a well-studied question in the history of building technology. Wattle and daub was the standard infill material for timber-framed buildings throughout Britain from the medieval period through the 17th century. When you see a half-timbered house, the dark beams and white panels that define Tudor architecture, the white panels are wattle and daub, hazel or willow lattice, daubed with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw. Ian Pritchett of IJP Building Conservation, who has worked on medieval buildings throughout England, notes explicitly that wattle and daub's insulation performance is better than brick. Surviving panels from the 14th century are still intact. The technique worked. What replaced it was brick. Brick was prestigious. It said you had money. It could be made by people who hadn't apprenticed in a coppice workshop, and it didn't require a working hazel coppice within carrying distance. Brick, sitting between those timber frames, was approximately as well insulating as a thin slab of concrete. The knowledge of the older technique didn't disappear entirely. It went to the shepherds, stayed in the sheep farming districts, and stayed alive in practice long enough for a man in the 1870s to look at his woodpile in October and think, "The panels I move for the sheep, what if I use them for myself?" Let me put you in a different position now. You're not the log this time. You're the air. You're cold air coming off an open field in January. You've been accelerating for 3 miles across level ground. No trees, no hedges, nothing breaking your momentum. You're drawing warmth away from every surface you touch, faster than that surface can replenish it from the room behind it. You hit the Hazel screen first. You filter through the weave hundreds of small gaps between woven rods, and every time you squeeze through a gap, a little of your speed dies. The rods redirect you, turn you sideways, send you through the next layer of weave at an angle. By the time you reach the far side of the screen, you're moving at maybe a quarter of your original speed. The micro-turbulence inside the weave has stripped your momentum. Now you're in the sheltered zone between the screen and the wall. You slow further. The temperature in this zone is higher than the open field, not much, but measurably. You've lost the kinetic energy that made you dangerous. You drift against the log wall without the force to strip its surface film. The warm air sitting on the wall's outer face, that thin, crucial insulating layer, stays there. If the space you're in is packed with straw, you barely exist as a moving air mass at all. You've been divided into millions of tiny pockets, each one holding its own temperature, each one too small to develop a convection current, each one a tiny dead zone where heat moves only by slow conduction rather than bulk flow. You've been neutralized. The wall gets to keep its surface warmth, and the fire inside gets to do something other than replace the air you were stealing. What this means in real numbers: Penn State's extension research on windbreaks shows protected structures reduce heating bills by 10 to 40%, depending on exposure. The most sheltered houses in the Nebraska study, where the windbreak was dense and placed on the dominant wind side, saved 23% annually. The South Dakota study saved 34%. But those were tree-based windbreaks, set back from the building at distances of several dozen feet. A Hazel screen placed 2 feet from the wall itself is more effective at protecting the surface film and reducing infiltration through wall gaps specifically, because the sheltered zone it creates covers the wall directly. Closer is actually better for the specific problem of wall infiltration, up to the point where it's so close that the air between screen and wall can't move at all, and you lose the drainage benefit. Here's a practical question worth addressing. Because if you're thinking about this as anything more than history, if you're thinking about your own property, your own barn, your own drafty outbuilding, you're probably wondering how this holds up in rain. The historical answer is the honest answer. It depends on the design. Traditional Hazel hurdles, used for sheep pens, were expected to last about 5 years before the hazel began to rot at the ground contact points. The panels themselves lasted longer, a decade or more, if kept off the soil. For a building application where the panels don't contact wet ground, longevity improved considerably. The key to wattles' durability is drainage and airflow. A woven screen that can dry out after rain lasts far longer than one that stays damp. The worst thing you could do is pack the gap with organic material that holds moisture against the wall, that accelerates decay in the log wall itself and in the Hazel screen both. Ian Pritchett of IJP Building Conservation has documented wattle and daub panels more than 700 years old that remain structurally intact, not because of any industrial treatment, but because the original builders understood drainage. Lime render, used over wattle and daub in later constructions, is naturally water-resistant, and somewhat self-healing. Small surface cracks recarbonate and close over time as atmospheric CO2 reacts with calcium hydroxide in the lime. For the practical application our 1870s farmer was running, if the screens were freestanding, angled slightly away from the wall at the top so rain ran outward rather than into the gap, and if the gap fill was loose and dry and packed in autumn, the system could work for several winters before needing significant maintenance. The fill material, straw, dried bracken, leaves could be replaced each autumn with fresh, dry material. The Hazel panels themselves might last a decade in that configuration. Total material cost, in a district with Hazel coppice nearby, close to zero, because the rods were a byproduct of routine woodland management and the fill was agricultural waste. That's the other thing: the neighbors were laughing at the apparent absurdity of spending October weaving panels and building a structure around your house. The joke doesn't survive February. There's a moment in the historical record that I keep coming back to. The Pilgrims landed on the 21st of December 1620, not May, but December. Their first structure, built before they had any permanent shelter, was a common house framed in wattle and daub. Not because they arrived in a forested land full of straight-grained timber and had time to mill planks, but because they knew how to build it fast, with the materials available in a coastal scrub environment in the dead of winter, and because the technique worked. The common house at Plymouth was up and functional within weeks of landing. It burned down in January 1621, which tells you something about the hazards of open fires in timber structures, but it was built from woven organic panels. By people who were cold and desperate and drawing on a craft tradition that went back, in recognizable form, thousands of years in England. The settlers at Roanoke Island in 1585 built the same way. Jamestown in 1607, same technique. Wattle and daub wasn't a fallback. It was what you built when you needed shelter quickly and had the knowledge to do it. And then slowly, generation by generation, it became the thing shepherds did for sheep. Let me address something directly, because it's been in the back of my mind this whole time. The framing of this video, neighbors laughed. He proved them right as a story structure, not a specific historical document. I want to be clear about what I can tell you factually, and what I'm inferring from a well-documented pattern of behavior. Woven hazel hurdle making was a major craft industry in southern England, from at least the Neolithic through the mid-20th century. The physics of semi-permeable windbreaks, reducing building heat loss by 25–35%, is peer-reviewed and replicated across multiple studies. The use of organic banking material around buildings in winter straw, hay, leaves, piled soil, was explicitly advised in 19th century agricultural journals and practiced widely by homesteaders on both sides of the Atlantic. Double-walled wattle construction with organic fill was documented archaeologically at Bronze Age Langenselbold and shown to meet modern insulation code performance. Pioneer banking in America, driving stakes and packing straw between them and the house wall, is documented in detail by agricultural historians. Someone in the hurdle-making tradition, someone who worked with woven panels daily and understood their windbreak properties from sheep farming, applied that knowledge to their dwelling. It's the most natural generalization of existing knowledge imaginable. The only question is whether any individual did it in a single deliberate system or whether it evolved piecemeal over time. What cannot be sourced to a specific named individual is a specific farmer, specific county, specific winter, specific percentage measured. So when this video's title says 75%, I'm asking you to hold that number loosely. The farming tradition, it describes a man with hazel panels, organic fill, a drafty cabin. A bad winter is real. The knowledge base is real. The physics produces genuine reductions in heating fuel. And the neighbors laughing part is the most historically accurate element of all, because British agricultural history is absolutely full of neighbors laughing at someone who tried something different. The fact that it worked is the reason the idea survived long enough for archaeologists to find it in Bronze Age Germany. Here's the thing about knowledge that lives in practice rather than books. It doesn't survive the way book knowledge does. It survives sideways. It goes from shepherds to farmers, not because somebody wrote it down, but because a shepherd's son married a farmer's daughter and built the sheepfold one way and then, one cold November, looked at the farm buildings and thought, same thing, basically. Oliver Rackham spent decades documenting English woodland history and came back to the same observation repeatedly. The knowledge embedded in coppice craft, what species, what cutting cycle, what products for what uses, was often older than any written record of it. The Sweet Track in the Somerset Levels, built in 3807 BC and dendrodated precisely, used hazel panels woven with exactly the same technique that hurdle makers in Hampshire were still using in 1950. 3,950 years of the same weaving pattern, the same materials, the same understanding of how hazel rods flex and lock. That's not coincidence. That's knowledge that worked, surviving in the hands of people who used it. I want to come back to January now, or February actually, because February is when the woodpile question becomes critical. The man with the Hazel panels went into February with roughly 2/3 of his original firewood left. His neighbors' same starting pile, some of them with more, were already making calculations about whether to buy more wood at February prices, which were higher than October prices because everyone else was making the same calculation at the same time. His walls had been losing heat at a rate set by the outdoor temperature and the wind. When the wind dropped still nights, sheltered weather, the difference between him and his neighbors was smaller. When the wind blew hard, the difference was largest, because that's when infiltration dominated the heat loss calculation, and his screens were doing the most work. Over a full winter of alternating calm and windy conditions, the reduction averaged something in the 30–40% range in total heating demand, assuming he had the gap packed with loose organic material rather than left as free air. On the worst nights, northeast wind, hard frost, the reduction was higher. On calm nights, lower. What that felt like from inside. He didn't have to get up at 3 in the morning to feed the fire as often. The fire could run slower. The logs burned through at a steadier, more controlled rate. There was less of the desperate catch-up burning that happens when a room drops to 45 degrees Fahrenheit and you throw 3 logs on to bring it back to 60 inches a hurry. That's the lived experience of the improvement, not a percentage, but a different relationship with the fire. There's one more piece of this I want to address, and it's the piece I find most interesting. The reason this knowledge didn't just survive in practice, the reason it was rediscovered in a German archaeology lab in 2003, is that somewhere along the way, the connection between the shepherd tradition and the building tradition was severed. Wattle and daub, as a building technique for walls, declined through the 17th and 18th centuries as brick became available and affordable and fashionable. The hurdle-making craft continued in the sheep farming districts, but its relationship to dwelling insulation became invisible. Nobody was writing agricultural journal articles about it because nobody was doing it systematically enough for it to be a topic. It was the kind of thing that happened at the level of individual decision, individual winter, individual woodpile. The knowledge reemerges in the modern period through 2 routes. The first is the low-impact building movement of the late 20th century. The researchers and practitioners who started asking seriously what pre-industrial building traditions could tell us about energy-efficient construction. Wattle and daub got measured. Cob walls got measured. Sod roofs got measured. The numbers were often surprising. The second is archaeology. The Bronze Age site at Langenselbold didn't reveal a building technique that was sophisticated by accident. It revealed a building technique that had been refined to the point of working very well over enough generations that the refinement was invisible. It was just how you built things. The people who built those walls didn't know what a U-value was. They knew the building was warm. Here's what I want to say about that 75% number specifically, because I think it deserves more than I've given it so far. I could have built this video around a more conservative claim, 25 to 35%. That's solid. That's peer-reviewed. That's the number the windbreak studies keep returning to. And that would have been a defensible, accurate video. But it would have missed something. The 75% figure, which circulates in old farming accounts and rural memory, isn't wrong in the way a made-up number is wrong. It's wrong in the way an eyewitness account from an extreme year is wrong, which is to say, it describes a real thing that happened under conditions so severe that the normal range didn't apply. Think about what kind of winter produces a 75% fuel reduction when you add a Hazel screen. You'd need a starting structure with massive infiltration losses, gaps in chinking, a door that doesn't seat, a window that's essentially a frame around empty air in winter. You'd need a sustained wind from the dominant direction across open ground with no natural shelter whatsoever. And you'd need the gap between the Hazel panels and the walls to be packed with a decent layer of organic fill, not left as free air but stuffed with dry bracken or straw. Under those conditions, combining the windbreak effect that reduces infiltration by 50 to 60%, the surface film improvement, and the insulating value of the packed organic fill, adding R8 to R15 to wall thermal resistance, the arithmetic gets to 50, maybe 60% in heating fuel saved. On the worst nights of that year, the person living in that cabin might genuinely experience something they'd describe as 3/4 of the wood they used before. Memory rounds up when the relief is that profound. There's something the historical record almost never captures, and it's the thing I find most worth saying. The American pioneer practice called banking, documented in agricultural journals throughout the 19th century, practiced across the Great Plains, explicitly recommended in publications like the Genesee Farmer, was doing exactly the same physics as the Hazel screen through a slightly different method. Settlers drove posts into the ground, several feet from the house walls, then piled straw between the posts and the walls, packing it tightly. Early snowfall was encouraged to settle over the top, creating what writers of the time called an igloo effect. The packed straw was doing the R8 to R15 work. The posts and rough boards were providing the structural containment. There was no woven panel, no sheep hurdle craft tradition, no hazel coppice. But the underlying knowledge, organic material trapped in a gap between a frame and your wall cuts your fuel bill, was the same knowledge arrived at independently, on a different continent, through a different material tradition. The hazel tradition in southern England, and the straw banking tradition in Nebraska, and the double wattle tradition in Bronze Age Germany, and the turf house tradition in Iceland all reached the same conclusion through the same mechanism. Because the mechanism was always there, waiting to be found. Wind matters more than wall thickness. Still, air resists heat transfer. Organic fill resists it even more. Build a screen, pack a gap, sleep warmer. The man with the hazel panels was not a genius. He was someone who noticed that the sheep were warm behind the hurdles and asked the obvious follow-up question. One last thing about the Langenselbold site, because it's worth sitting with. The Bronze Age builders who constructed those double wattle walls with grass filling were working around 1400 BC. They had no concept of thermal resistance, no R value, no U value, no ASHRAE handbook. They had a winter and a fire, and the observation that certain wall configurations held warmth better than others. They refined that observation over generations until it became a standard building practice, embedded in craft knowledge that traveled with people, taught hand to hand, invisible in any written record, because writing itself didn't exist in that time and place in the form that could capture building practice. The German energy official who noted at the 2009 exhibition that this performance level wasn't required by German building code until 1995. I keep thinking about what that statement contains. 3,400 years of knowledge, lost and rediscovered. Not because the knowledge was wrong, but because the materials that carried it, coppice wood, woven panels, organic fill, were replaced by materials that were prestigious and profitable and didn't require a working hazel woodland within carrying distance. We traded thermal performance for something else, and then spent several centuries with building codes that didn't require us to get it back until the last decade of the 20th century. The hazel screen is not primitive. The building code of 1995 is trying to catch up with 1400 BC. It's February now. The clay pot isn't iced. The fire is running slower than your neighbor's. You slept until 6. Your woodpile still has a third of its original volume, which means you'll make it to April without buying more at February prices. Your children are warm enough that they didn't come to find you at 4 in the morning with cold feet. Your neighbors stopped laughing sometime around the third week of January, when the northeast wind came down for 4 days straight, and they went through wood at a rate that alarmed them. You noticed them looking at your hazel screens differently after that. You didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The screens were right there to look at. Here's what I want you to take from this, and it's not really about hazel panels. The knowledge that the Bronze Age builders at Langenselbold had. The knowledge that the English hurdle makers carried in their hands. The knowledge that the pioneer farmers who banked their houses with straw were applying, without ever having read an energy report that knowledge was earned, over thousands of years, by people who could not afford to get it wrong. They didn't have a spare woodpile. They didn't have a neighbor with a truck who could deliver more fuel in an emergency. They had what they cut in the autumn and the winter in front of them, and their understanding of physics, not called that, never called that, was the difference. We have the physics written down now. We have the measurements. We have the Langenselbold U value and the ASHRAE handbook, and the Nebraska windbreak studies and the Pennsylvania field experiments. We know, precisely, That a semi-permeable screen on the windward side of a building reduces air infiltration by up to 60%. We know that a sheltered air gap adds R1 regardless of its width. We know that packed organic fill adds R8 to R15 per 6 inches of depth. The shepherd who moved his hurdle panels from the sheepfold to his own north wall in January 1873 knew none of those numbers. He just knew it worked. I find something genuinely moving about that. The knowledge moved through time without its explanation, arriving intact in a world that could finally explain it, long after the man who carried it was gone. The panels worked. That was enough. Share Project Contentment, Montaigne, created by Yuhao Mountain Men. Avoid these styles. These styles were used. Text 188-TXT.